Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on what difference has Laudato Si made in the faith community. I'm excited to say good afternoon. It's 3 o'clock here in Washington, D.C., but this is the largest webinar that we've hosted for Catholic Climate Covenant. We had well over 600 people who signed up. Several hundred of you are on, and it's ticking up by the second. So I could really say good afternoon, I could say good morning, I could say good evening, because we actually have participants from 4 continents who have signed up to be on this call. And I think that, of course, we know why. It's because Ed Maibach is such a wonderful researcher and has great things to share with us. But before we start, I would like to invite us just to take a moment to center ourselves and to say a small prayer. So if you'll join me, let us remember that we are in the holy presence of God. We thank you, Lord, for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle as we care for the common home. Amen. I want to remind you of today's timeline for the program. We're scheduled to go for 45 minutes, from 3 to 3:45. Our presenter will have about 30 minutes or so for his presentation, and then we'll open the floor for questions for 10 or 15 minutes from you. The questions will be shared with the presenter in a written format. So I'm going to tell you how to do that. If you will look at the black bar on your left-hand side, you will see at the very, very bottom a drop-down box. Right now, mine says send to everyone. I think that would be very distracting with so many of us on the call. So let's just run up here and say send to presenters. I'll be moderating the questions that Ed will be fielding, so it would be easier if you just send it to the presenters rather than everyone speaking to everyone else. So many people are saying hello to one another, so that's really fun to see as we go through with this. So I will give you a brief introduction of Ed Maibach, and let me move the slides ahead as I do that. By the way, my name is Maggie McCarty. I'm a staff member here at Catholic Climate Covenant. And our featured presenter, Ed Maibach, not only has a master's in public health and a Ph.D., but he's a university professor at George Mason University and director of the Mason Center for Climate Change Communication. Ed's research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, NASA, and private foundations, and it focuses on the public engagement in climate change. He recently co-chaired the Engagement and Communication Working Group for the 3rd National Climate Assessment. He earned his Ph.D. in communication science at Stanford University and his MPH at San Diego State University. And he's previously served as Associate Director of the National Cancer Institute, Worldwide Director of Social Marketing at Porter Novella, and Chairman of the Board for Kids Save International. It is our indeed pleasure to welcome today Ed Maibach as our featured speaker. Ed?
Thank you, Maggie, and welcome to you all. I'd actually like to thank you all for joining us today. It's really fabulous that so many of you are interested in this topic, and I'd particularly like to thank my friends at Catholic Climate Covenant for encouraging my colleagues and I to do this research. They really have played an important role in this project from the beginning. Now that you've seen me, I'm actually going to turn off my webcam so that we can enlarge the slides. Because I'm going to show you some data now over the next 20 or 30 minutes, and then we can close out the hour by talking about what I've found and what I've shown you. All of the data I'm going to be showing you comes from the fact that my colleagues at Yale University, the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, and my team here at George Mason University, we have an ongoing audience research effort. We call it Climate Change in the American Mind. We conduct a nationally representative poll of American adults every 6 months, so every spring and every fall since 2009. As we were planning our March 2015 survey, so a year ago, we got wind, in part thanks to Dan Misla, we got wind of the forthcoming encyclical, and we decided that this sounded to us like perhaps a once-in-a-decade opportunity to study the impact of an important new voice weighing in on climate change in America, and to determine what impact, if any, that new voice had. So everything you see, everything I tell you today will be from our Climate Change in the American Mind Audience Research Project data. Let me begin with the backdrop. So this is from our survey a year ago today. The backdrop, we found that Catholics are even a year ago, were already more engaged in the issue of climate change than were Americans in general, and especially more engaged in comparison to mainline Protestants and members of the evangelical community. So I'm not going to go very deep into this, but this is just, these are the data from the, in response to the first question we asked people about global warming. And we give them a short introduction. We say, what do you think? Do you think global warming is happening? And we give them three options: yes, no, or don't know. And so what you can see here is the responses to those data. So a year ago, 69% of American Catholics answered that question yes, in comparison to all Americans, which were only at 63% at that time. And now I want to take even a step further back and give you the backstory. What we consider to be one of the most important findings from our research from these national public opinion polls that we've been conducting since 2008. And that finding is that there are 5 key beliefs about climate change that are highly associated with a range of what I consider appropriate attitudes and behaviors or actions about climate change. So if you look on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see 3 bubbles there. The first one says support for a societal response. So that represents people's beliefs that the United States should respond to climate change. The bubble just beneath that represents people's support for various specific climate response policies. And then the bubble on the bottom that is titled Political and Consumer Activism, that represents the degree to which people tell us they are personally involved in political activism. And by that, I mean contacting any elected member of government at any level of government over the past year, and consumer activism, which is whether or not over the past year they have either made purchasing decisions based on their perceptions that a retailer was aligning themselves with climate solutions, or boycotting, not purchasing from retailers who they feel are impeding America's progress to respond to climate change. So those are what I would consider appropriate attitudes and actions. There are 5 key beliefs that are strongly predictive of which Americans feel that America should move forward with an assertive response, the degree to which they support specific responses, and the degree to which they themselves are rolling up their sleeves and helping. And those 5 key beliefs are fairly simple, actually. It's believing that climate change is real. So I showed you a moment ago some of that data, with that basic question we asked: what do you think? Do you think climate change is real? The second key belief is whether or not they believe it is human-caused. The third key belief is whether or not people understand climate change as bad for people, not just bad for plants, penguins, and polar bears, but whether they see it as a human problem. The fourth key belief is whether or not they see it as a solvable problem. People if people understand we have a problem, but they don't see it as solvable, they tend to turn their gaze away from it, because it's difficult to stare a difficult problem in the eye if you don't believe we can make a difference. And then the most fundamental of all of those key beliefs is whether or not people understand that there is a scientific consensus about human-caused climate change. That's the bubble on the extreme left-hand side of this slide. So those are the 5 key beliefs that are strong predictors of the belief that America should be moving forward and addressing this problem. So let me just show you what that data looks like on those 5 key beliefs. And I'm going all the way back to 2008, but what I can tell you before you even strain your eyes too much to look at these slides, there hasn't been a lot of change in any one of these 5 key beliefs since we started this polling project in 2008. As you can see from this first slide, which is simply the belief that climate change is real, you can see that it's waxed and waned a little bit, but not a lot. So currently, as of a year ago, 63% of Americans said yes, it's real, 18% said no, it's not, and the remainder said they don't know. So if approximately 2 out of 3 Americans think it's real, only about 1 out of 2, about half of us, believe that it's us, that that global warming is happening as a result of human activity. And again, you'll see there's a little bit of waxing and waning, but generally speaking, Americans' views of this have been fairly stable over the past, say, 9 years. We have a lot of different indicators in our data set that get at that sort of gauge people's understanding that global warming is bad, that it's harmful to humans. This happens to be one of those indicators. This is the proportion of Americans who say that global warming is already harming people in the United States. So that's about 1 out of 3 of us believe that people are already being harmed in the United States. And another thing that we've learned, I'm sort of going off my 5 key points here for a moment, but this is a really important thing for you to understand. The average American sees climate change as a distant threat. Distant in terms of time. They're more likely to see it as a problem for the future than a problem for today. Distant in terms of space. They're more likely to see it in terms of a problem for people elsewhere, perhaps sub-Saharan Africa, not here in America. And distant in terms of species. They see it as primarily a problem for plants, penguins, and polar bears, not a problem for people. So this is a very busy slide, which is why I've put a box around the part of it that I want you to actually look at. The red box on the right, we ask people which of the following statements comes closest to your view. These are statements that attempt to get at people's sense of the solvability of this problem. So starting at the top, you can see that 46% of people in a year ago said that humans could reduce global warming, but it's unclear at this point whether we'll do what's necessary. It's not an unreasonable response, but it is certainly a jury is still out response. Going down the page, you can see that 1 out of 4 Americans, 24%, said humans could reduce global warming, but people aren't willing to change their behavior, so we're not going to. That's a pretty dismal, skeptical response, not helpful, not at all the kind of belief that we would want Americans to have. The next most common response is that 13% that people who say global warming isn't happening. Just below that is the light blue triangle. 12% of Americans saying humans can't reduce global warming, even if it is happening. And at the very bottom of the slide, only 6% of Americans said humans can reduce global warming, and we are going to do so successfully. I don't know about you, but as a social scientist, that's a belief that I would certainly like to see encouraged and cultivated to the greatest extent possible. Because when we face difficult problems, if we tend not to believe in the solvability of those problems, as I said a moment ago, we tend to avert our gaze and turn our attention to other problems that we believe are fundamentally more easily solved. And so here is the 5th and the final one of those beliefs. The one that I said a moment ago is sort of the most fundamental. I didn't explain why I said that. It's the most fundamental because people's understanding of the scientific consensus, we call it a gateway belief. It influences, to the degree that we understand there is a scientific consensus about global warming, it heightens our belief that global warming is real, it's human caused, it's serious, and it's solvable. It's fairly simple to understand why that might be so. Global warming, climate change is a very complicated problem. There's a lot of detail. Most of us have no training, no scientific training in climate science. So if we believe that there is a lot of disagreement among the experts, we're likely to check out and decide it's best to pay attention. We will start paying attention if the experts finally do come to one mind about the problem. So what you can see from this slide is that only 9% of Americans a year ago correctly estimated, even in broad terms, that essentially 9 out of 10 climate scientists think that human-caused climate change is happening. I'm sure you all know the number's closer to 97 or 98 or 99%. But we generally consider this answer 91 to 100% as the correct answer. And you can see that only 1 out of 10 Americans or fewer know the correct answer to that question. So again, to recap, those were the 5 key beliefs that from our research, we have just have concluded are so very important in cultivating engagement in this issue, and none of them have changed very much in the past 6 years, not since 2010. So the open question, and the question that I hope to answer for you right now is, did Laudato Si make a difference? Has the Pope's teachings on climate change made a difference over the past year? But actually, I'm sorry, I forgot. I decided to throw in 2 more slides before I answer that question for you. The first of those 2 slides is simply to show you that most Americans aren't very worried about climate change. As you see from the box on the right-hand side of this slide, a total of 52% of Americans a year ago said they were at least somewhat worried, but only 12% said they were very worried about climate change. I can tell you that I am very worried about climate change, and I can tell you that the climate scientists that I spend my days working with are almost entirely very worried. So this is a real disconnect between the public's emotional reaction or emotional response to the issue as distinct from what Americans who know most about the issue are feeling. And then this one final slide, again, going back to March 2015, this is one slide that perhaps concerns me the most, and ultimately, it sort of set up the whole way in which we thought about the evaluation of the Pope's teaching on climate change. As you can see on this slide, the rate at which Americans are talking to one another about global warming, talking to their friends and family members, the very people you would want, that we would want them talking to about the issue, you can see that it's been, unlike the big 5 beliefs that I showed you previously, which waxed and waned just a little bit. You can see in this case, the rate at which Americans say they're talking about global warming with their friends and family, either often or even occasionally, has drifted downward fairly sharply since 2008. I mean, this is very much, to my eyes, a real trend. And it's a trend that I very much hope we have ways of turning around, because until Americans are talking to one another about this issue, we're not likely to be taking the issue as seriously as it warrants, and we're not likely to be taking the kinds of actions that we need to be taking to address the challenge. So let me give you just one.
Ed, may I interrupt you for just a second? Several people have asked in the questions section, and just before we go too much farther, they're all wondering what was going on in 2008 that might have made for a downturn. I'm thinking about the global economy taking a tank about that time, but maybe you could talk a little bit to people about what was going on. What do you attribute this drop that began in 2008 and went through 2011?
No, everybody who I'm not able to look at the comments coming in, but thank you for translating them for me, Maggie. Yes, that's exactly what happened between 2008 and 2010. Was essentially the tanking of the global economy, and the fact that 1 out of 4 mortgages, I believe it's roughly 1 out of 4 mortgages in America went underwater, which meant 1 out of 4 of us on this call, in all likelihood, had all of that additional stress and anxiety in our lives. You know, owning a home owing on a home more than it's worth. And many of us lost our jobs or were afraid of losing our jobs at that time. Unemployment rate, as you recall, rose above 10%. Cognitive scientists, psychologists, talk about the fact that we have a finite or limited pool of worry. We can only worry about so many things at any one time in our life. And when when more of us were worried about financial issues than in any normal time, and in a very real and understandable sense, it simply takes away the ability for us to pay attention to other more distal concerns. And while climate change, I certainly believe, and based on the evidence, that climate change is happening here and now in America in every community, it is still a more distal concern than somebody who has just lost their job or is worried about losing their job or worried about losing their home. So that really strong downtick that you saw before it ticked back up again, to the best of our knowledge, that is the primary driver. In addition to that, there was I will call it an incident that some people counsel us not to call ClimateGate, the theft of emails from University of East Anglia and Penn State University, and the misrepresentation of what those emails meant the misrepresentation as that they meant climate scientists were not honest brokers, but they were playing fast and loose. So I'll just call it the denial sphere was kicking into high gear at that time, both because of ClimateGate and because of the fact that in 2009, the U.S. House of Representatives passed legislation, the Waxman-Markey bill. So it looked as if our federal government was going to take its obligations seriously. And that was a shot across the bow for organizations in the denial sphere that they really put the pedal to the metal to try to sow discontent and doubt at that time.
Thank you.
So let me move on, my pleasure. One last idea that I want to sort of sow for you, and that is the fact that frames are consequential. And by frames, I mean how an issue in American life today is represented in the media and in public dialogue. And the reason why frames are consequential is because the frames used in media and in the public dialogue eventually end up shaping how you and I think about that issue. So every public issue has many possible ways in which it can be framed. Climate change has many, many possible ways in which it can be framed. But the specific frames that are used most frequently in the media and in public dialogue will have the most outsized influence on public understanding of the issue. So the question is, what, in the minds of Americans, what kind of an issue is climate change? And I can tell you, because we've been tracking this now for quite a long time. First and foremost, Americans see climate change as an environmental issue. As I've already said, they see it as a threat to plants, penguins, and polar bears more than a threat to people. The second frame that the public uses to understand climate change, or the second kind of issue the public sees it as, is as a scientific issue. Scientific issues may be interesting to many Americans, but they're not terribly engaging. Science is not something that we tend to pay all that much heed to in general, and issues that are seen as scientific are fundamentally less engaging than issues that have direct personal perceived relevance. So the third issue, the third way that Americans see climate change is as an agricultural issue. This is fairly new. My colleague at Yale, Tony Leisowitz, has actually been using this question, conducting questions like this, using this question in his polls for over 15 years now. It's only in the past couple of years that we've seen the emergence of public understanding that climate change threatens the food that we need to feed ourselves, our family, and people, the other 7.2 billion people on the planet. But seeing climate change as an agricultural issue is a fundamentally more engaging frame than seeing it as a scientific or an environmental issue. The fourth most common issue frame that Americans use to organize their thoughts about climate change is as an economic issue. Unfortunately, for most people, they're seeing it wrongly. They're seeing it as a threat to our economy, that responding to climate change is a threat to our economy, as opposed to what I believe is the more appropriate way to see it, is that not responding to climate change is a threat to our economy. But that is very much a minority view out there in America today. Fifth and finally, and in part in response to lots of good work by the public health and medical community over the past few years, an increasing number of Americans are now understanding climate change as a personal health issue. So here is a summary of the data that I just showed you, but I wanted to put the summary up to make the point that as of last year, relatively few Americans were seeing climate change as a moral issue, as a poverty issue, or as a social justice issue, which is relevant because Pope Francis has decided that these are precisely the kinds of issues that climate change not only not only is, but this is the kind of issue that he is encouraging people of faith all over the world to consider, to get beyond our traditional views of the kind of issue that climate change is, and to look deeper at the more consequential nature of the issue. So he has been preaching, as you all know, about climate change as a moral, a social justice, and a poverty issue. Now, finally, back to our research that has evaluated the impact of his teachings. We have two different research projects. They're related to one another, but I just wanted to separate them in your minds so you understand. I'm going to give you data now from two different sets of polls. The first set of polls are the poll that I've already shown you some data for from March 2015, and then the poll that we conducted last fall of a fresh cross-sectional sample of 1,250 Americans. So each of these two sets of survey responses were unrelated to each other. We interviewed different people at both points in time. And what did we learn from those people? Well, we learned that there was an uptick in the proportion of Americans that say global warming is happening. It's not a big uptick, but it was 4 percentage points, an increase of 4 percentage points between spring and fall of last year in independent cross-sections of Americans. We learned that not a enormous proportion, but not a non-substantial proportion of Americans told us that the Pope's position on global warming has had either a lot or some influence on their own views about global warming. So among all Americans, 5% said that that was the case. Among Catholic Americans, 20% said that was the case. And very similarly, we learned that 19% of Catholics said that the Pope's position on global warming has made them either moderately more concerned about global warming or much more concerned about global warming. And among all Americans, it was 5%. So again, these aren't enormous changes, but these are not changes to be dismissed. For those of us who work in the realm of public opinion polling and even public engagement programming, this is a pretty large change for a 6-month period, especially given it wasn't until our fall poll was conducted shortly after the Pope's departure from his trip to the East Coast of the United States. So while he released Laudato Si on June 18th, most Americans probably didn't hear about it until his trip to the US. And to the issue of how are Americans understanding it, are they starting to understand it more as a moral issue, a social justice issue, and a poverty issue? The answer is yes, particularly so for Catholic Americans. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see that between spring and fall, there was a 10 percentage point uptick in the proportion of Americans who say that global warming is a moral issue, a 10% uptick in the proportion who said that it's a social justice issue, and a 7% uptick of the percent who said it's a poverty issue. The changes weren't nearly as big for Americans at large, but we still saw a 5% percentage point increase in the proportion of Americans who say it is a moral issue. So again, substantial response in precisely the way we would expect if Americans were paying attention to the Pope's teachings on climate change. So that was the results from the two independent surveys. What I'm about to show you now are the results from what we would call paired surveys. These are the technical term for it was a panel survey or a longitudinal survey. In the fall of 2015, we went back and we resurveyed as many of the 1,250 people that we surveyed in the spring. I could talk all day about why we would bother doing that, but I don't have time, and you don't have time, and I don't have time to talk all day. I'll simply say it is a complementary research procedure to the use of independent cross-sections that I've already showed you. So what did we learn? Well, very importantly, and this really helps us keep in perspective Americans' response to Laudato Si, and that is most Americans don't know about it. They don't know the Pope's views about global warming. That's 45% of Americans, only 45% of Americans, and only 56% of Catholic Americans had heard about the Pope's views of global warming, and only about 20% or 25% said they were aware of the encyclical. So there's more work to be done to teach, to educate Americans about the encyclical, about the Pope's views on this issue. The job certainly wasn't fully done as of early October last year. However, a really interesting question for us was, when the Pope decided to release his encyclical, would it have a backlash? Would it hurt the Pope's image? Would it hurt the Pope's trust among Americans as a result of weighing in on an issue that many Americans unfortunately see as more political than moral? And what we found here is no, it had quite the opposite effect. Actually, there, among Americans overall, Americans' view of the Pope increased by 7 percentage points. Among Catholics, his very positive favorability ratings increased by 13 percentage points. So the potential for backlash very clearly was not seen in the data, and we think that is good. We've learned that the issue of global warming became more salient for Americans in general, but particularly for Catholics. So 10% more Catholics. There was a bump in 10 percentage points of Catholics who said they now hear about global warming in the media at least once a month or more frequently. Almost 2 in 10 Catholics said the Pope's views were discussed in their place of worship. I'm sure many of us would like that have been 98% and not 18%, but 18% is a good number. And there was a 5 percentage point uptick in the proportion of Catholics who became more likely to discuss global warming with their friends and family. So coming back to that issue I introduced a moment ago, that until we're willing to talk about this issue, we're probably not taking the issue as seriously as it warrants. And then finally, many Americans said the Pope made them more concerned about global warming. 35% of Catholics said that the Pope's views had influenced them. And half of those people, approximately half of those people who said the Pope's views had influenced them, said that they had become more concerned, while fewer than 1 in 10, fewer than 8% to be specific, said they had become less concerned. So that means about 4 out of 10, it didn't make them more or less concerned, but that they took note regardless. So this is simply a graphic representation of what I've already shown you. This is the question: how much, if at all, have the Pope's views on global warming been discussed in your place of worship? You can see that only 2% said a lot, 8% said some, 8% of Catholics said a little. So not perhaps as much discussion in churches as we would like, but a pretty solid start regardless. And this is a representation of how much impact, if any, has the Pope's position on global warming had on your own views about global warming. You see a similar sort of pattern. So more influence among Catholics than Americans at large. But again, the majority of Catholics said not at all. 50% said not at all, and 14% said they weren't sure. A couple of other key findings: more Americans came to see global warming as both real and bad for people. So the uptick in the proportion of Americans among this panel, 6%, there was a 6 percentage point uptick among the panel members at large, a 13 percentage point uptick among Catholics who said they became very or extremely sure that global warming is happening. The next point, I think, is very important because it was such a large impact. More Americans, and especially more Catholics in the panel, said they think that people in the developing country and the world's poor will be harmed by global warming, a moderate amount or a great deal. Those are very large differences in a very short period of time. So while those are not exactly the same as the framing data I showed you a moment ago, which I'll show you in a moment again, that those are obviously related frames. So the degree to which people feel people in the developing world or the world's poor will be harmed. So back to the framing questions. Again, in the panel data, as well as with the cross-sectional findings, more Americans and especially more Catholics came to see global warming as a moral issue, a social justice issue, and a poverty issue. Finally, and of considerable interest, despite the changes in Americans' views about global warming during that 6-month period, we saw a very tepid increase in the proportion of Americans who feel that America should respond to the issue. So while Americans were starting to come to understand the issue in a manner more consistent with its scientific reality, it wasn't yet translating into greater public support for an American response. So what do we conclude from this? Well, my colleagues and I conclude that more Americans, especially more Catholic Americans, have become modestly more engaged, and concerned about global warming, and have started to see it as a moral, a social justice, and a poverty problem. Many people even credit the Pope for this evolution in their views. So all in all, I would say that the initial 4 months, the impact of the initial 4 months of post-release of Laudato Si was created certainly a discernible impact, and I would represent it as a meaningful impact. But, here's the important but, this uptick that I've been talking about may turn out to be what some of us in the public polling world call a blip. In other words, it might well just be a temporary uptick, and we might see it trend back downward again, sort of consistent with the data I've shown you over the past 8 years. Or, conversely, this could be the start of a truly important trend. As of yesterday, we actually came out of the field. We had conducted our spring 2016 CCAM survey, came out of the field yesterday, and I've already had a quick peek at it. I'm hope we'll be releasing that data to the public later this month. I'm hoping that our data will suggest that this is, in fact, the start of an important trend. Certainly what I've seen thus far indicates to me that all of the uptick that I've shown you has increased over the past 6 months as opposed to settled back down. But here's the final thought that I want to leave you with. And I offer you this thought as a career public health professional. Before I started working on climate change, and even over the past 10 years as I have worked on climate change, I come to this work as a public health professional. I've worked on many important public health initiatives over the past 35 years. And if there's one thing we've learned from those initiatives, is that the successful public engagement initiatives almost always have simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. So if the uptick that we've seen between spring and fall of 2015 and the uptick that I'm suggesting might have occurred over the past 6 months, if leaders of the faith community sustain or redouble their efforts using their trusted voices, it's likely that this uptick is going to continue and become a meaningful, sustained trend. Conversely, if we've already heard most of those voices, if those voices now turn their attention to other issues, and if other trusted voices also turn their attention to other issues, it's likely that we will not see a meaningful, sustained trend. So I would suggest to you that the future is in our hands. We know what we have to do. We have to use our trusted voices to convey simple, clear messages as often, early and often as we can, and to encourage others who have trusted voices to put their trusted voice behind these messages as well. So with that, I open the floor up to, I guess, Maggie, you're going to be the moderator for questions?
Yes. Yes, I will be the moderator for questions, and I have been sort of following the chat to hear what people are saying. I know that many people that are asking if they, I know that we're recording this. Some people are looking for a PDF of the slides. Is that possible to get a PDF
yes.
of your slides? Or?
Indeed, I've already sent Paz a PDF of these slides, so she's more than welcome to distribute them to everybody.
All right, everybody, that's the answer. The second has a lot to do with the comments that are running alongside. I don't know that our webinar has the capability of saving the comments. A lot of people have had a lot of good things that said before you log off, if you're interested in the comments, you can block individual people's comments and save them. I'll see what we can do, but I'm not sure that the comments are a savable part of the any meetings package, so I apologize for that. So I'm sorry, Ed, somebody asked a very good question about wondering, does it matter whether you use the word global warming or climate change in terms of results? Do you have any information on that?
I'm almost too embarrassed to admit how much research I've done to answer that question.
Okay.
It turns out to be a really good question, and the answer to the question is very subtle. The term climate change is a term that conservative Americans feel more comfortable with. They see global warming as a more political term than a scientific term. But so on one hand, if you're talking to conservative Americans, you might find that they feel more comfortable with the conversation talking about climate change. But we know that the term global warming is a term that people feel more strongly about. It is a term that engenders more, that carries with it more affective connotations. If you could only use one, I guess I would encourage you to stick with the term climate change, but global warming. But really, the differences are rather subtle. So I would say it's user's choice.
So forgive me, I actually lost contact there for a minute.
Okay, and actually, I see Tom Kearns's comment that he uses the term the climate crisis. Tom, I use that one myself often. I also like climate disruption. It's obviously not a technical term or a scientific term, but it actually gets it really gets at the gist of what climate change is. The real concern is that we are disrupting our climate, a disruption that could last for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so when I'm engaged in a conversation, whether that's with community members or otherwise, that I feel I can use that term, I do, because I think it's a very accurate term, climate disruption.
Excellent. Now, another question that's being asked, it has to do with the data itself. It's asking, were those polled only English speakers?
They are only English speakers. I can tell you that Hispanic Americans are more concerned about climate change than Anglo Americans. And I can tell you that Spanish-speaking surveys of Hispanics in the southern portion of the Americans, they too, virtually everything south of the U.S. border, there's much higher levels of concern among Spanish speakers than we see in most other regions of the world.
And I think the final question that I picked up is, do you have any suggestions? Everyone on this call has come to you from being involved with Catholic Climate Covenant. What, if any, suggestions do you have to those people who are in their congregations, in their church communities, in their religious orders, in their Catholic hospitals and schools? Could you give us any last final comment about what suggestions do you have for us as we attempt to continue to spread this message of Laudato Si?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you. That's a great question. So coming back to what I showed you earlier about the framing, I think it's really important that we move away from global warming as an environmental threat. As much as I personally get warm fuzzies when I look at those pictures of polar bears, and I shudder to think that they are endangered as a result of climate change, I recognize that I am only, that is a view shared by only about 1 out of 3 Americans. Approximately 1 out of 3 Americans see themselves as environmentalists. So that isn't really a strong frame for us to use. I think that the frame of the faith community, the frame of the teachings of Pope Francis is a wonderful frame for you to find ways to continue starting conversations about. And despite what I said about the scientific frame as not being emotionally engaging, it is actually an intellectually affirming frame. So the fact that members of the faith community feel that this is a topic that we need to be discussing to make decisions about the best possible responses, and that they're essentially standing on the shoulders of tens of thousands of climate scientists around the world who are virtually unanimous in their view that human-caused climate change is happening, and that the projections from the future range from bad to worse, and that the decisions about do we want bad or do we want worse rest in our hands. And so the actions that we take, the decisions that we make today, will determine whether or not we continue to see climate impacts on the serious but not devastating side, or whether we essentially let this threat get away from us, whether we delay too long and ultimately end up causing enormous hardship and in a very real sense, tragedy for hundreds of millions, if not billions of people over the next 100 and more years. So I think that ultimately is the most important point to make, is that the decision is ours. And ultimately, nobody can tell us what is right for us as individuals, what is right for us as community members, what is right for us as America. Nobody can tell us that except us. And in order to sit down and have to think that through carefully, it really helps to talk it through with other people of shared values. And that's the conversation that I hope all of you are able to start and to sustain in your both geographic community and your spiritual community.
Well, excellent. So let us thank Dr. Ed Maibach for all of this incredible information. Yes, this recording was recorded. This webinar was recorded. You'll get an email in the next day or so that gives you information on getting back to the recorded. We can also send out slides. And speaking of the we is Catholic Climate Covenant, and we have lots of resources available on our website, so please check them out if you're looking for things to do in your local congregations or in your local schools or hospitals. And just know that more webinars are being scheduled throughout the year as part of Catholic Climate Covenant's free programming. So for all of you, there's still over 300 people online, and we had over 600 registered, and people have come in and out, but it's just been a great opportunity to continue to talk about this. So on behalf of all of us at Catholic Climate Covenant, thank you, have a great day, and don't forget to check out our website. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.